Okay, great. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for putting our paper on the program. I have the tough job of like the late afternoon session, so I figured there's nothing better to get your attention than some data construction. So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes. So this is joint work with Aaron, who's right here, and also Chris and Juan, who was a grad student but now is at Amazon. This is going to use a lot of census data, so we have this very long and detailed disclaimer at the bottom. Okay. So let me begin some motivation. So what do we know about the geography of US exports? Okay, so you might have all seen papers that use sort of state-level US exporting data. How accurately does that actually tell us anything about the where goods that are exported from the United States are actually produced? Okay, it turns out that if you look at microdata, the answer clearly is that we don't know very much. Why is that? For several reasons. So first, the commonly used US trade data sets that, again, publicly available that you might have used before, they do not actually identify the origin of an export. So the origin of, or where an exported product is produced. Okay, what they do identify is the origin of movement of a shipment. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily have to correspond to the origin of production. I'll go into that in detail. They also don't tell you about the destination of imports. That's something that we're not going to address in this paper. Okay, so they also don't tell you that, but that's a separate issue, not in this paper. Firm level trade data, which is available if you go through the hurdles of like getting census access, you can get access to firm level trade data. That does not resolve this issue either, because almost all trade, almost all exporting in the US is done by large multi-unit firms. Okay, and they can have plants spread out across space, and so you still don't know. You might see a firm exporting, you don't know where that export came from. Like I already mentioned, the state-level data that is often used in sort of spatial models is based on the shipment's origin of movement, which does not have to correspond to the origin of production. Okay. Why does this matter? So, I mean, this matters for a number of reasons. So first, if we want to try to understand the effects of exporting on local areas, on any subnational units, the best approach that we have right now is to impute local exports using, local employment shares, for instance. Okay, some measure of local economic activity. We don't actually know whether this is a good imputation or not. Okay, and I'm going to show you actually it's not, right? Many other research questions could also require knowing something about the establishment that is actually involved in an export transaction. So where is it being produced? What are the features of that establishment, and so on. Many other data sets that are available for work for researchers that have access to confidential data tend to be at the establishment level. Okay, so lack of a link between exports and establishment is problematic for research in general, for research and trade in general. So what we're going to do in this paper, we're going to do what I promised. We're going to do some data construction. Okay, so the heart of this paper is going to be a new algorithm, which researchers that work with census microdata, and that is now increasingly common. There are many RDCs across the country. People, are increasingly getting access to census microdata. So we're going to have an algorithm that researchers can implement relatively straightforwardly. I say relatively because the algorithm is complicated, but we're going to have this algorithm which researchers can use to build microdata on the geography of US exports. Okay, this approach is going to allow people implementing the algorithm to identify with a high degree of certainty establishment level exports, including which, then the zip code of the establishment, and every other feature of the establishment that is available to you in the census data. Okay, so we in this project currently have implemented this algorithm on the years 1993 to 2021. Okay, but again, depending on the years available to other researchers, this could easily be extended to other years, okay, as data become available. And in the data set that we're going to use today, we're going to have establishment level exports, which includes very rich detail, including the destination of exports, okay, the very narrow product being exported, and the date. So this is transaction level data, so the date of shipment. Okay, so this is very, very rich, very granular data. And again, we highlight that we're going to have an algorithm because we're not allowed to disclose these data. And for people who have worked with census data before, you will know that you can't transfer data across projects. Okay, so what we can transfer and what we can disclose is the algorithm to set this up, which other researchers can implement on their projects to get to build the same data set. With these data, I'm going to then show you some new facts. I'm going to show you that even within the US, geography plays a role in export destination specialization patterns. I'm also going to show you that exports are highly concentrated across space, much more so than employment or sales. Okay, this is going to immediately imply that imputing local area exports using observable variables like employment or sales is going to lead to systematic biases. Okay. In particular, you're going to overstate the exports of very small areas and understate the exports of export-intensive areas. Okay, so systematic biases in that procedure. To highlight that, we're going to then have one application. That application is going to focus on the Great Trade Collapse. We're going to study the local area effects of the Great Trade Collapse, of the decline in exporting during the Great Trade Collapse. And I'm going to show you that in an IV specification, employment, payroll, and wages declined in counties that were relatively more exposed to foreign demand shocks. Okay, I'm going to then, to really highlight the role of the data, I'm going to do the exact same exercise using publicly available data, imputing county level exports using employment shares. And I'm going to show you that that's going to deliver noise. Okay, we're going to find no results. Basically, it's not possible to estimate these positive effects of exporting without the more precise data. And then we have, so when we were asked to put this paper on this program, we caveated that the census has, worked with us for a while on this project, but is not allowing us to disclose a lot anymore because of the granularity of these data. We did convince them in a very last-minute effort to allow us to disclose something that might be interesting in the current environment. So to show again what our data can do, I'm going to also have another application where I'm going to show you at the MSA level, so the Metropolitan Statistical Area level, which areas in the US are most exposed to possible retaliatory tariffs. Okay, so I'm going to show you the top 20 MSAs in terms of their exports per worker that go to China, to Canada, to Mexico, and potentially all three. Okay. I'm happy to take questions as I go along. This is a data construction paper, so yeah.
Yeah, just to clarify, what is the difference between your data and the normal custom transaction data that identify who are the exporters?
The short answer is that the customs level data is firm level. Okay, so the customs data, and I'm going to go into that in detail. The customs data tells you the firm that is responsible for an export transaction, and we're going to go from there towards the establishment that likely produced the product that is being exported. Firms don't have necessarily an address unless they are a single unit, right? Because they might have multiple establishments across the country.
And related, then people proxy for exports from that establishment using sales and employment of the same firm in that establishment.
That is our least preferred approach to identifying where something was produced. And in fact, we have to do that in a small case of the matches. And we're going to call those like our poor quality matches, and we try to not use them for most of what we're doing.
But this is not what others do. So when you talk about using other proxies people have used, those are not the proxies, or they are?
Oh no, that is like one available. Yeah, that is one available method. But again, I'm going to go into deep and bitter detail on how this is constructed. Okay, so everyone is going to be really immersed in the census at this point. Okay, so we're building on a bunch of literature. Let me just go straight to how we do this. So we're going to construct a new data set of US export transactions at the plant level. So we're going to have a couple of key ingredients that are fairly standard census data sets that anyone that has kind of been in census adjacent projects might have seen or heard of before. So the first core building block is going to be the longitudinal foreign trade transactions database. So this is the standard customs data that just came up in the previous question. It's going to be the universe of transaction level trade in goods with links to the firm responsible for the transaction. okay? Not the establishment. It includes the date, the value, the quantity, the HS10 product codes, so very, very narrow product codes, as well as destination country and other variables. Okay, so everything that's in the customs record is in these data. We're going to also be using the longitudinal business database, also something that I'm assuming everybody will be pretty familiar with. This is the universe of US private non-farm establishments. It includes annual employment and payroll information. And importantly for us, it's going to have establishment identifiers linked to firm identifiers. Okay, so this tells us, it provides a kind of a picture of which establishments belong to which firm. Okay, so that's going to be a key step here. It also has establishment NAICS codes. Okay, so industry codes more accurately belong to an establishment and not to a firm. So it's going to have establishment level NAICS codes. And naturally, an establishment is a physical entity and has a location, so it's going to have a zip code for the establishment. Okay, and finally, we're going to need some product industry concordances that we obtained from Pearson Shot. Okay. So I have one slide, which is just kind of starting up the algorithm, and then Aaron has put together a bunch of beautiful pictures to make it a little bit easier to digest what we're doing. So conceptually, what we're doing is we know, as I said, the LBD gives us all possible establishments of a firm that is involved in an export transaction. Okay, so if there's just one establishment that belongs to that firm, mapping or allocating an export transaction to that establishment, to that geography is trivial, right? It's just an immediate step. Now, what happens if there are multiple establishments, multi-unit firms? Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to try to identify the establishment that was likely the location of production of that product using three pieces of information. Okay, so the first, we're going to use a variable in the lifted, which does tell us about the origin of movement of a particular shipment. Okay. As I've highlighted, that does not have to be the origin of production, but if we looked at the data and we saw that, hey, this firm has a manufacturing establishment in the same zip code as the origin of movement, maybe that's the right establishment. Okay, so that helps us. That's a useful piece of information. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to use what we call production associated industries, or PAIs. This we're going to use a separate associated census file. It's a census of manufacturers' products trailer file, which basically lists for every establishment in the census year what products it reports producing in that year. Okay, this thing only exists in census years, right? And it's pretty noisy because establishments might list 10 products and then list a nonsense product. That kind of stuff can happen. So it is pretty noisy, but we can take that together with information on the establishment's industry and construct the likely industries that are principal producers of particular products. Okay, so if we look across all established in the census, that kind of removes some of the noise in an individual establishment's report. Okay, and then finally, up until 2017, there used to be a question in the annual survey of manufacturers, the census of manufacturers, which asked establishments, do you export? Okay, and if you export, what is the value of your exports? It had nothing more, no more detail in it. It didn't say, where are you exporting, what products are you exporting, none of that. It was just like a yes or no question together with the value of your exports. That variable actually now has been discontinued, so it doesn't exist anymore from 2017 onwards, which is, annoying for us, but also bad for research. But we also, for the years that we do have it, we're going to use this variable. Okay, yeah. Definitely. I mean, in a sense, what we have is an algorithm. We're trying to find the most likely origin of production of a particular product. In some cases, we will find that, the firm has no manufacturing establishments, so it's a likely wholesaler or retailer. And in that case, that's kind of where we have to stop, right? We cannot say, we can still assign the trade to those establishments, but we flag it as being not. I'm going to show you that we have different flags, and we have the cases where we think we have very high quality allocation, and the cases where we can't go any further back from the manufacturer, the retailer or the wholesaler. Yeah.
What do you do about agriculture?
We drop it. Right now, yes. No. In this algorithm, we have dropped agriculture, right? I mean, we can think about ways to extend this to agriculture, but in what I'm showing you today, we have currently dropped agriculture because there's a lot. Agriculture particularly is going to have this this issue with the origin of movement, origin of production, because there's going to be warehousing and consolidation of shipments, and so we, for now, don't have it in here. In a way, you know, it's kind of nice to present an algorithm too, because we could improve on it, right? And other researchers could also improve on it, and so there could be ways to do that.
But that's what it, because the LBD only has non-farm stuff. That's the thing. So but that's, if I want to know about like soybeans to China, you know what I mean? This is, is there any way I can do that, or?
The data, the trade data have them, and then we would have to
I want to know where, like, is it from, like, you know, Cedar Rapids, or is it from?
The LBD is not going to help with this, but there are other censuses which we have not leveraged.
I see.
Which might help. I mean, I'm speculating because we haven't actually used them, but it's not there's other censuses which might be useful for that. Aaron might have a better answer for you.
No, I think that's right. I think Nitya's point is that it seems to be the case that agriculture in particular is subject to this consolidation issue where the origin of movement is often the area directly close to where the port is. And so what you would get with this origin of movement in the published data is a lot of agriculture coming from like areas close to ports, which is not going to be right. So that's where that's just not going to be a useful indicator.
But we just didn't have supplementary information to try to make that better.
Now that said, having the firm that's associated with the export might help you identify the location, because you might be able to know that that firm somehow is present somewhere else, but you have to use these other supplementary
censuses,
to get more.
Yeah, exactly. Other questions? Okay. So that's kind of the pieces of information we're going to use, and we're basically, the algorithm is going to combine them in different ways. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. Let me highlight one example, okay, of what we're going to do. So suppose we start with an export transaction from the lifted. It has the firm, the product, the country. Okay, so it's a transaction. And then we look at that firm and we say with the LBD, we can link it to all of its establishments. Okay, all of its non-farm, but all of its LBD establishments. So suppose we have candidate establishments A, B, C, D, right? So now this export transaction, the origin of movement variable is going to give me a zip code. Okay, and I can take that zip code and I can look at the zip codes of the establishments and say, hey, okay, maybe in this case, there are 3 establishments that are in the right zip code, 1 that's in the wrong zip code. Okay, so that helps me to narrow it down a little bit. And I can look at my next piece of information, which is now the production associated industry. Okay, so that tells me that these 3 establishments are in the right industry for that product. That one is in the wrong industry, so now I'm going to roll that one out. So now I'm down to two potential establishments. And then if I look at the survey question, and this establishment happens to be, you know, it's a census year, and these establishments are in a census year, so all of them have answered this question. This is the only one reporting exports. Now this tells me that in this case, this is, you know, with very high confidence, the place that this export was produced. Okay, so that's going to be, that transaction is going to be assigned to this establishment. Okay. This is like a very straightforward, simple case. The vast majority of cases that we have are not that straightforward and simple, all right? So here's another case where, you know, I have the same zip code. It turns out the firm does not have a single establishment in that zip code. Okay, so something else was going on before it got shipped from that zip code. So then I can look at the industries. The industries, 2 of them are the wrong industry. 1 of them is non-manufacturing, so it did not produce that product. There's only 1 industry that, you know, is the right type of industry for that product, and that establishment coincidentally is also reporting exports. So now I can assign that transaction to that establishment. Okay, slightly more complicated case, still not as bad as it can get, and it gets really bad. So this is just a very simple illustration, right? And so in the actual algorithm, we have 15 steps for different cases we can cover. And then we get to a case where we need to use some kind of proportionality. We don't like those cases. And so we flag them, we do it, and we say that, you know, be cautious with these data, okay? When we use proportionality, we start, if we can, with these exports. Okay, so rather than using employment or sales, because I'm going to show you that's pretty bad if you do that, we start with, for the years that it's possible, looking at the share of exports. So we have the plants of the firm in a census year, and they report exporting. We look at the relative shares of exports and then assign exports that way, when we have to do it, but we don't like doing it. Okay, so that's the algorithm. So this is what it looks like. So we were allowed, so this is kind of grouping some of our flags together into broad categories. Okay, and I'm going to tell you, so the blue is single establishment, direct links. The red is where the zip code is kind of the main thing that the zip code of a manufacturing establishment is the main, reason it got assigned. The green is where the industry was the main reason it got assigned. And then the yellow and the purple are the cases where we have to use some kind of proportionality, and so we don't like them. We flag them as our not preferred cases. By and large, it's pretty stable. I mean, the exact category varies based on whether you're in a census year or not census year and so on. But we get high quality matches that are between 65 and 75% of the data. Okay, you'll see this big gap here. This is because now census is not allowing us to disclose this anymore. But we managed to get this year back out, right? Okay. So that's what it looks like. It's pretty stable. Okay, so this is the result of the algorithm. Questions? Yeah.
So would it make sense for big firms that maybe report themselves, like the distribution of exports across establishments? You can check those for a few of them and then check whether your algorithm does well for those firms that report, in case some firms report, which I don't know. But
so what we have in the census and what we have done so we have papers and proceedings on this last year, where we implemented this algorithm for like a couple of years, 2012. And what we did there is we compared our allocated exports to where we just use, we take the trade data and we allocate it. We compared it to the value of exports reported in the census surveys by establishments. Those are aggregated values across all locations. Okay, we found a very, very high correlation at the intensive margin. At the extensive margin, not, because we actually have more establishments exporting than if you look at the census. And so that's what that paper was looking into that in more detail. But the intensive margin, I think that's the answer to what you were saying. It's the same thing as a firm reporting exports. It's what the firm is saying in the census. And there we found a very high correlation. Other questions? Data construction is really exciting, guys. This was like, we started this in 2016. Okay. Yeah.
So you motivate this by saying that firms may have different plans and different establishments. And if you want to understand the impact of trade liberalization at the local level, we need to look at the local level plan and establishment. And we cannot just look at the firm level.
That's one example of a research question, yes.
What if all those decisions are made at the corporate level? Like corporate level, they say that we need to restructure, we have to close down certain plants, we need to cut down our labor force by however many percent because of tariff. And the decision is not made at plant level.
I mean, that is definitely happening, right? But I think that's a different type of research question. So there's a question where if you want to look at the effect of a decline in foreign demand on local areas, right? It doesn't matter whether it was the corporate firm that made the decision for this plant that was already exporting to like shut down its exports. We just want to trace that effect to the employment in that county. Okay, so it's just a different research question. I think that's one very valid research question. This is just which our data are probably less useful for, but where I'm going to go is going to be a little bit different. Where in a sense, all I need is an exogenous demand shock, actually. So it doesn't even have to be. I'm going to use an exogenous export demand shock, but.
So the decision making is not.
I mean, we don't identify how the decision was. So we don't identify. Okay, so we don't have a model that tells you how that exogenous export demand shock translated into a decline in county level employment. I'm just going to show you the IV results, and then you could have a model that takes, it could be that decisions are made elsewhere. It could be that decisions are made right there. There's something that translates the decline in demand into the local GE, and we're not going to have that kind of model because this is an algorithm paper. So but there are models you could write. Right? Other questions? Okay, good. Let me show you now then some stylized facts. Oh, before that, here's just so we have disclosed the state level aggregate data, okay, so that not by destination. We have some destinations, but not all destinations. But we did disclose that to be able to compare it to publicly available state level data. And so here are some of the cases where, the public, this is 2021, the shares in the public data vary from our data, and you can see that, in percentage points, the differences are small, and the correlation between sources is actually very high, but the percent differences are pretty large, okay? The time series correlation is also high, but it's not perfect. So there are differences once you aggregate up to states. Okay? And you do see that, like, there are some states that are like Indiana, where the publicly available data is lower than our data. We have more exports coming from Indiana than you get in publicly available data, right? You'd expect that because it doesn't have ports, okay? Okay, so let me show you a couple of facts. I'm going to show you first, yeah.
So how do you know it's established that both in and out of accident?
That's a great question. So in the actual algorithm in like step 14, when we are not sure, when we still don't know, we have a set of establishments where you could all be candidate exporters and nothing in that year's data is helping us. We look at the next year and the previous year to see if the establishment was exporting with high confidence the year after and the year before, and we use that information to fill in this. But there are cases where our data will, if our data we don't find an export transaction for that establishment, and then we find it the next year, that will exist in the data. So we will have that extensive margin. It just exists. In the regression I'm going to show you later, it's not going to matter because we have one cross section. Okay, so there's going to be no extensive, I'm not going to decompose the margins into intensive and extensive margin. But in the actual allocation data, the algorithm tries to use information from previous and subsequent years. But, if that doesn't help us, then there will be an extensive margin of exporting in there. Laura? Oh, no, I think actually like standard trade models tell us that exports should be more concentrated than employment or sales, right? I think that I'm fully on board with that being expected. It was just not shown before, and studies that were trying to do local area stuff were ignoring that and directly proportioning exports out using employment. And I'm going to show that's problematic. But yeah, I'm fully on board. And we say it up front in the paper, like this is what you'd expect, actually. Take the Melitz model, exports are going to be more concentrated than employment. Right? Okay. So let me show you just a little bit more about the data. So first about some internal geography. So again, like I said, we can look at the destination of exports at a very granular level. Okay, again, we can look at the destination of exports at a very granular level in the census. What they will let us disclose is a different issue. So I'm going to show you something about states. Okay, we would like to do this much more detailed, but we battled and we failed in that battle. So what we're going to do is aggregate our data at the state level and calculate the relative destination composition of state exports to a particular destination compared to the US average. Okay, so the way to interpret the math I'm going to show you is a particular state exporting relatively more or less to some destination, okay, as a share of its total exports. So here is Canada. So this tells you that, again, you can quite clearly see the role for geography in here. Places closer to Canada are exporting relatively more to Canada, and places further from Canada are exporting relatively less, okay, than the US average. But again, it's not everything. This is Mexico. Okay, so Mexico, there is geography, but there's also actually a lot of exposure here, right, in the Midwest. And finally, this is China. Okay, so China here, not surprising, but also quite a bit on the East Coast. I'm going to go a little bit more detailed and show you the MSAs later, because we managed to get a little bit more detail there, but we couldn't do it for every subnational geographic unit for the US. That was just not allowed. We would have liked to have some nice heat maps that they did not allow us to do. Okay, so that's the geography, but now let me show you the concentration. And again, I'm fully on board with this being an expected pattern, but we think it's important to really see that it's there and to see that there's no simple fix for it. Okay, so it's not that I know the Pareto shape parameter, and so I can just directly figure out what the relative concentration of exports and employment is. That's not going to happen. Okay, I'm going to show you that. So economic activity is highly concentrated across space, exporting is concentrated across firms. Putting these together, we're going to show you that, concentration of exports is much more than employment or sales. What are we going to actually do? We're going to aggregate employment, sales, and exports by county. We're going to rank counties by each measure. Counties don't have to be aligned across measures, okay? But we're going to rank them by each measure. And we're going to calculate cumulative shares, okay? And we're going to have 20 quantiles. So this is what it looks like. So you can see that employment and sales are both pretty concentrated. We know that, okay? But if you look at exports, it's much, much more concentrated than employment or sales, okay? So that's an aggregate. And again, that's what you'd expect from many of our models. So that's overall for the US. Now, what happens if I break it down by state? Okay, so here's an example of 4 states. What you can see is this pattern, the relative pattern holds across all states. So and here I have a log scale for legibility, okay? But the relative pattern holds across all states. Exports are always more concentrated than employment or sales. But, how much more concentrated? That varies across states, okay? You look at Pennsylvania, they actually track pretty closely, okay? You look at Texas, they don't track at all, right? So it's not as straightforward as saying I'm going to take, publicly available data and adjust it, right? Because you need to know this adjustment factor, which can vary even by state or at smaller units. So it's not very easy to do this. Here's what it looks like if I just show you the proportion in the top decile, okay, for some states. These are the states we've disclosed. And you can see that, again, all of these variables are concentrated. We would expect that. But if you look at Pennsylvania, employment and exports are pretty similar. It's about 51% in the top decile. If you look at Texas, 81% of employment is in the top decile, but 96.4% of exports. Okay, and then these ratios vary across states. So this should be very suggestive already that imputing exports to local areas using employment shares or sales shares is going to be problematic. Okay, it's not going to be it's not going to be very good. Okay, so I have how much more time?
Well, you got a lot of questions, so I would say 15 minutes.
Oh, thank you. That I don't need. I mean, go for it.
So you said millets as one of the benchmarks. How about like just a basic balls and beans type of thing, where you have establishments that are symmetric, but you only use some of them to export, but otherwise they're perfectly substitutable. That would give you like another benchmark, I guess, right? And so can you sort of tell whether it looks like a balls and beans kind of thing, where exports is a fairly unusual activity, and that's why it's concentrated, as opposed to exports is a activity done by the most, like, I don't know, productive units? And
oh, that's a great question. So just looking at this, I can't tell you that, because obviously both of these would give us the relatively more concentrated exports, right? But that's a good research question, which other users of these data can use, is that the census data, the advantage of linking the trade to the establishment is then you have access to every other thing you know about the establishment in the census, and that includes the ability to estimate productivity. And it will be, I think, as simple as estimating the productivity of the establishments that are exporting and see whether they're slightly different from the ones that are not. That would be something that could be done, and that would distinguish between these.
Here, like a balance table of do they look similar or not?
Here we have not done productivity. No, we have not. We haven't disclosed anything at the establishment level. Okay, that's I think yeah, and I don't think, I think the issue for us that we're facing on this project is, given what we have disclosed at the MSA level and so on, I don't think we're going to be allowed to disclose stuff that is really about the establishments, because there's going to be too much overlap. I mean, they will worry that we will figure out which establishment was I mean, somebody will figure it out. So that's. Yeah. I mean, I don't make the census rules on this. So it's like none. Like we yeah. Of course it can be figured out, but like we are. But it would be possible to do it. So it's a research question that would be feasible. Okay, so what we're going to do today is show you the issues with the imputation. Okay, we're going to highlight that with this application, which also serves to illustrate the positive effects of exporting. So we had some stuff this morning about the negative effects of lots of imports, and now we're going to have some positive effects of exports. Okay, so what we're going to have is a very simple estimating equation. Okay, so this is the baseline estimating equation. We're going to take some outcome variable, look at the difference from 2009 to 2007. Okay, and we're going to regress that on the change in exports of this period over this period. Okay, some controls, and we're going to be running this at the county level. Okay, so that's why C is a county, and we're going to normalize everything relative to the employment of the county in 2007. Okay, so this, of course, does not, if you look at it, obviously, it does not affect the estimate of beta, which is what we're interested in. Okay, it affects the constant, but the normalization is helpful to present results. We're going to consider employment, okay, and we're going to consider payroll, and we're going to consider a wage rate. Okay? When we have wages as the outcome, we're going to measure wage changes, average wage changes in percent changes. Okay, so that's not going to be normalized by employment. The controls are going to be county exports per worker in the base period, 2007. Okay, and then the lag dependent variable and sometimes state fixed effects. So we can also identify within, using within state variation. Okay, now, of course, there's an endogeneity problem, right? So exports and say employment as the outcome, these are determined simultaneously. Okay, and what we want to do is isolate some exogenous demand variation here. Okay, and to identify beta. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to take a very standard instrument. We're going to take the world import demand instrument, but we're going to make a modification, which we think is particularly important in the setting that we're considering. So this instrument is simply going to, for each county, be the weighted sum of exports to a particular destination country in a particular product, where the weights are pre-period weights, so 2007 weights. And then this is normalized by exports over employment, okay, because counties vary in their exports relative to employment. What is different from the standard world import demand instrument is that we're going to demean foreign country imports in a particular product by the average world imports of that product. Why is that important? That's important because, you know, you think that some shocks could vary worldwide at the product level. Okay, and this is the Great Recession. You think that the demand for durables might have changed differentially from the demand for non-durables. Okay, and so if I don't demean by the average imports of durables, for instance, then my demand shock here could be correlated with local demand, with US demand for that product. Okay, and so this purification helps us to identify, hopefully, exogenous variation in foreign demand. Okay, so our variation that we're going to be using is going to be a county's exposure to declines in a destination's demand for its products that are greater than the average decline in demand for that product worldwide. Okay, so destination-specific idiosyncratic declines in those products, basically. That's going to be the variation we're going to use. So then it's like a shift share IV. We are going to rely here on the exogeneity of shocks. Okay, so we're going to design everything following Carroll's paper. Standard errors in the first stage and so on are all set up with the Borusiak, Jaravel, and Hull paper. And so here are some results. Okay, so here's employment, here's payroll, here are wages. And, you know, I have with and without controls. I want to highlight that the shock level first stage is high, okay, across all of the results. And that this is, you know, whenever you implement the Borusiak approach, you get worse FStats. Okay, so ours are still pretty good. But what we have here is that, whether or not we have controls, the effects are positive, significant, and similar. So what we get here is $1 million. The way to interpret these coefficients is that $1 million decline, exogenous decline in exports of a county results in a decline of about 17 jobs. Okay. And then there's basically a 1-for-1 pass-through of a decline in exports into payroll. Okay. And a $1,000 decline in exports results in a 1.9. Was that $1,000? I think that was 1,000. Decline in exports results in a 1.9% decline in the wage rate. Okay, so that's what we're getting. But again, no, then it's $1 million. $1 million. Yeah, the scale seemed off to me. That was a little bit crazy. Okay. Yeah, so this is $1 million. Yeah.
Maybe you should do payroll, like overall payroll.
This is overall payroll here.
Oh, that's sorry.
Yeah, this is payroll is 1-for-1 basically. So exports decline is 1. Yeah, this is close to 1, the coefficient. So payroll declines 1-for-1. This is the wage rate.
Sorry, it's a question, but are the two weights times employment should be equal to payroll or?
Wage times no. So this is wage per work. This is a wage rate. I guess actually, yes, approximately. Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is. I think we could. I think we can do that. Yeah, no, I think we can do that actually. It's just fine. But I think that this is approximately anyway going to be. Yeah. Okay. Good. We can break this down. We can break down the employment into manufacturing and non-manufacturing. And we see, again, at the county level, naturally, it's the manufacturing establishments that are directly affected, okay, because they're the ones that are exporting. But there's also roughly a little less than half the effect is in non-manufacturing. So there are within county spillovers. Okay, so that's what's going on. Okay, but again, to highlight the data, right? So now we're going to repeat that exact exercise. Nothing in that exercise. You could not do publicly available data if you're willing to impute local area exports with some employment weights or some kind of payroll weights. Yeah.
I think you should stop there and just tell us what, I mean, these numbers are very interesting. Like,
okay.
What does it mean for Michigan? What does it mean for Indiana, right? How many jobs did they lose because?
We can do, I mean, that, okay. I mean, we can, that is a good idea. And we can actually do, I mean, again, relatively, this is all, there are fixed effects, but yes, we can do that. Yeah. We can do simple, that's a great idea, we can do that.
I mean, you should pause, tell us what the numbers and then do that.
Okay, I can pause and I can tell you that things look worse for Michigan than they do for, I don't know, but we didn't calculate them, so I have to, yeah. But yes, we can definitely do that because we have the shock, we have, yeah.
Also, is there a way to say something like overall, over this time period, there were like 1 million jobs lost, and then exports, you can actually attribute to exports, not many. Again, all the differences.
I mean, I can basically construct stuff from this using, I know these, right? Like, and I can, but again, there's caveats that this is kind of a simple aggregation, not taking into account, yeah. But we can do that. We didn't do it, but we can. That's a good point. We can do it. We emphasize instead, like, what is the value of the data? But okay, but this, yeah, we can definitely do that. But exporting is beneficial. That's like the main takeaway, right? Like there's a lot of job loss from the decline in demand from exporting.
Okay, sorry, I promise last question.
Okay.
Do you also have like high skill jobs, low skill jobs?
No, so that people who are implementing this algorithm can have if they use the LEHD. We are not, we don't have the LEHD in this at the moment, but if you have a census project where you implement this and you have the LEHD, you can extend it to that for the states where LEHD is available, but we don't have it. Okay, so here's the imputation with publicly available data. We take the standard state level trade data, we strip it of agriculture and mining, okay, so it lines up with our data. and we impute county level exports using the share of employment in that county in that particular industry. Okay, for a particular product, we can do it in levels or growth rates. The results are basically the same. And then this is what it looks like if you compare our data with the state level data, with the imputed data, okay, for two counties. And you can see there's a pretty systematic bias, right? You're going to, if you do the imputation, as is not surprising, you will overstate the exports for the smaller counties and you will understate the exports for the biggest counties. Okay, so that part should not be surprising. But let me show you the IV results. Okay, so we can construct our instrument with the imputed data and the export value with of the counties with the imputed data, the right-hand side variable with imputed data, right? And so if I do that and I run the same IV, okay, you see that, I mean, the estimated values are positive, but the F-stat is so small that you can't do any inference here. Okay, this is just total noise. And you can also see that it's very noisy. You can't use this, right? Then we try to understand whether this issue is coming about because of the instrument, which uses imputed data, or the second, the right-hand side variable. Okay, and so here you construct the instrument with our data, right? And the right-hand side variable is with the imputed data. And you see that the F statistic improves. It's not great still. It's not as good as it was before. You do get positive and significant estimates of the effects on employment, but they're extremely noisy. Okay, so they don't rule out what we actually estimated, but our estimates were precise. And here you don't have that. Yeah.
Remind us about the magnitudes.
Sorry, can we perhaps, because she's 10 minutes over time, so maybe we can try to wrap up.
The benchmark is 17. Our precisely estimated value is 17, and you can see 17 is within the standard error here, but the standard errors are giant, so you'd get like all kinds of things, and this is nothing. Okay, so let me finally show you my MSA. I mean, I asked for questions, so I got the questions. So I appreciate that. Let me now show you my MSA export destination exposure. Okay, and so this is 2021 data, so we're very excited about this. So this is like really very recent exporting patterns. Okay, so here are places, so MSAs in the US that are most exposed to Mexico because their exports per worker to Mexico are the highest. Okay, you can see there are quite a lot of areas in Texas. That's not surprising. Okay, but you also see Detroit, you see places in Alabama, you see South Carolina in there. Okay, so these are all places very exposed to any trade war with Mexico. Here's China. Okay, so you can see now a lot of variation, and particularly if you look in detail at which MSAs are most exposed to China, you see that you have Austin, Madison, Columbus, Rochester, San Jose, lots of sort of tech, high education intensive areas. Okay, and then here's China, Mexico, and Canada. Okay, so now I have many colors, including cases where you're exposed to all three. Okay, and so you're in the top 20 MSAs exporting to all of these places, and you can see there's a lot of variation, which again, you can only uncover by this kind of approach to identify potentially for policy which areas might be most affected by any trade war. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap up and say, wrap up, because what we're doing in this paper is painstakingly built this algorithm so that people can have microdata at the establishment level on US exports. And we found lots of interesting patterns using these data, and we think these data can help us to better estimate the effects of exporting on local areas, but hopefully also many other research questions going forward. Thank you.
I find data construction very exciting. So this was a very cool paper to discuss and learn about. So, okay, just okay. Nitya has already done a super good job of talking about this paper and summarizing it, but just in like a few second summary. So they develop a new algorithm to map confidential firm level exports to their underlying establishments. And that can be implemented using US restricted census microdata. And this paper uses an array of restricted use data very, very innovatively to actually allocate exports to different establishments. As a result, we are now able to see track down exports to zip code level establishments. And why I think this is super important, because we all work with customs data all the time, and customs data is always at the firm level for most countries, but we are, as trade economists, super interested in local area effects. And because the firms are not really and to answer anything at the local level, we actually need to think of establishment level. So I think there's this fundamental inconsistency, or not inconsistency, what we have and what we want to ask. And I think that's where this paper makes a huge contribution. And that's why I think it's super important. And in the version I read, there was this cool MSA level result that Nitya showed was not there, but it talked about two important things. So basically, they showed that US exports are much more concentrated than both employment and sales using this data. And the second was an illustrative example that they showed that actually, if you look at the Great Recession, you can see that the counties that experienced greater declines in foreign demand performed much worse in terms of employment pay and wages. Now, this effect vanishes if you use the publicly used data, simply because there's just too much noise from the imputation. I'm going to just say that today my discussion is going to be a bit limited, because I understand that they cannot do much more work with this data for this paper, because I spoke to Nitya, it takes ages to get any approval. So I tried to keep this discussion very constructive, about more like brainstorming rather than going into the nitty-gritties of data which cannot be implemented. So that way it's a bit limited, my discussion, but we'll see. So one of my first reaction was that we all love to know about local labor market effects, and everywhere we have access to customs data. So because they have been able to construct this establishment level data, will it be possible to tell the mass users of customs data, firm level customs data, is that for which type of firms is this kind of imputation a big problem? Like, can we say that maybe there are certain industries where firms are so agglomerated that they're basically having all of their establishments in certain counties? So for these industries, actually using the firm from the customs data is actually not that bad. So are there certain types of industries which are like high versus low tech, or which are producing more differentiated goods? Maybe for these, I don't know, I'm just speculating, maybe for some of these industries, this is not much big of a problem. So it would be really nice if there could be some discussion on this. And so I think, and a related comment I was thinking is that because this establishment across firms are likely, that because a firm is ultimately at the head of the establishment, there could be some spatial correlation. And I don't know, I think in the OLS, it would be a two-way firm and state level clustering as opposed to the, but this a relatively more minor comment compared to the big picture comment here. And then this is where I'm going to just go into my brainstorming mode about what can be done using this data. So here, I think a lot of the things that actually Nitya showed here was talking about how geography plays a very important role in export specialization at the state level. Gravity matters. Very minor thing. It would have been amazing to see the gravity estimates rather than the raw export changes. But I thought, and I'm sure you also thought, but I think this is just for us to just brainstorm here. I felt that there is a lot of dynamic things that we can learn from the establishment level data. So we know so many things about firm export into firm survival, entry into export markets, into exporting new products, but we do not have any idea at the establishment level. So this data can be leveraged to talk a lot about these firm level facts, but at the establishment levels. And I mean, of course, this is very important because you see that the establishments are like the true, if there's a new establishment, that's like a true creation of an entity, rather than because inside the firm you could have establishments one closing and another one opening, and nothing happens at the firm's level. So, but this establishment changes basically allocation of jobs and all at the regional level. So that this could be super important. And in that same mode, I also thought that there is this literature that there's actually a lot of work in the bank on export promotion. That's why I think that came to my mind first, because when I just looked at what kind of export promotion things exist in the US, I actually found a lot that almost every state has some kind of export promotion policies of their own. And almost all of them have some sort of local content requirement. Like, I mean, I'm just showing two examples, which I found through ChatGPT and went to the website to actually confirm that they exist. But I think that actually without establishment level data, it is almost impossible to study any effects of local export promotion regime. So I thought this could be a very interesting direction of research. And of course, there are many, many more, but just coming from the again point of view of maybe of a bit of an urban economist, but I was thinking more about agglomeration. We know there are benefits of agglomeration, spatial clusters, and there's also this literature on like when firms start exporting to a new market, what helps them, what do they learn from other firms who have started exporting in the same industry. But these establishments would be like the conduit of information. Like if you look at a geography and an establishment next to you starts exporting to a new market, do you also start exporting? So I thought this is another area where this data can be very productively employed to actually talk about this, entry into new markets, learning about new products. And so I mean, I know that these are all speculative and just about uses of the data, but I thought it would be super important in the paper if you have like a section. You focused a lot on the cross-section aspect, but if you have like one section talking about like the possible important uses of this data, I think it would be very big value added. So yeah, well, thank you very much. So.
Perhaps we see if there are another couple of questions because we're a bit over time, and then Nitya can answer everything together.
I was wondering, like, there are like 15 steps in the algorithm, right? So would it make sense to, and I guess like the farther you go, the more uncertainty there is in whether you're allocating it properly. Would it make sense to compute these concentration measures under different stopping rules? Like saying, imagine I trust only the first 5 steps and you compare for the subsample of, and then going whether things change a lot depending on how far you go. And...
Okay, definitely. Okay, good. Well, first I want to thank Devaki for the discussion. We really appreciate. We actually need a section that talks about other uses of the data. So we thank you. I do want to advertise that the one thing we have thought about separately is like the firm level, where the firm level facts translate to establishment level facts. We looked at sort of the extensive, looked at the fraction of firms that are exporters. We think is 20%. We actually find that at the establishment level, it's a lot higher. So we have done that in this one paper and proceeding. But there are many others that we could explore. I fully agree. And yes, absolutely. We have actually done some of this in the census, right? We just didn't disclose all of we can't do it for every single step. I think the steps that we think we are confident in are the ones that I mentioned. That said, I want to say that like the last parts where we think we have less confidence, where we're using any kind of share to allocate the data, that actually brings us towards having less concentration. Okay, does that make sense? Because those are cases that we're converging towards public imputation, using the imputation method of public available data. So in a sense, you'd get more concentration if you remove those establishments. Okay, thank you very much.
Paper.
Should I start?
Yes.
Sure. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jose. Thanks for organizing and for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about rules of origin and the use of NAFTA. This is joint work with a colleague at the Bank of Mexico, Alfonso Cebreros. Now, when Mexican firms export to the US, they basically have the choice of either using the trade agreement or not using it. If they choose to use it and their product they're exporting to the US is Mexican, they don't have to pay any tariffs. But now, what does it mean for a product to be Mexican? This is defined by the rules of origin, which are the criteria needed to determine if an export can use the free trade, NAFTA in this case. For the case of the North American Free Trade Agreement and now USMCA, rules of origin specify exactly which intermediate inputs need to be sourced from which North American countries for it to count as a Mexican product. So for example, imagine you're exporting a car to the United States. Rules of origin would, let's say a car is made of plastic and steel. Rules of origin would specify you can source the plastic from anywhere in the world, but you have to source the steel exclusively from North American countries, okay? In that case, the product is considered Mexican, and therefore you don't have to pay any tariffs when exporting, okay? But now, what if the US or North America in general are terrible suppliers of steel? In that case, rules of origin introduce a trade-off at the firm level between lower sourcing efficiency, that is, for example, I would like to purchase the steel from China, but I have to do it from the United States, Canada, or Mexico, and lower barriers to trade, not paying a tariff when exporting, okay? So these are the research questions of the paper. How do rules of origin affect the use of a trade agreement and their implications for bilateral trade flows in North America? Now, why should you care? 50.8% of global trade occurs between members of free trade agreement. That is, firms are either using trade agreements or for whatever reason, they're choosing not to use those, okay? At least 62% of all free trade agreements around the world contain rules of origin. But the reality is that we don't really know their effects at the firm level. Why? Because information on which firms are using these trade agreements is really hard to come by. And this is where the paper comes into play. Okay? Now, this is important because we need, in recent times, we have, Trump tariffs. We have the renegotiation of USMCA next year. It is important for us to know the effects of these trade policies, better understand their effects, so we can better design trade policy. Okay? What this paper does, basically in terms of data, we build a data set on firms' use of NAFTA. That is, we can observe whether a firm used NAFTA or not for its exports to the United States at the transaction level. Okay? We can observe from which countries it imported which intermediate inputs. We complement this data with the rules of origin at the product level and also the tariffs if the firm is exporting to the United States, okay? With this data, we document 3 empirical facts. The first one is there's a positive correlation between rules of origin and tariffs at the product level. Second empirical fact, how firm size affects the use of the trade agreement. In particular, we document an inverse U shape. And third empirical fact, we basically study the effect of using NAFTA to export to the US on non-NAFTA sourcing. That is, for example, the probability that a firm purchases intermediates from China, as an example, okay? And this effect is increasing in firm size. With this empirical facts, we basically motivate or we rationalize them using a model of input sourcing and include into this model the choice of using the free trade agreement and rules of origin in it. We include fixed costs of using the free trade agreement and fixed costs of being able to source intermediates from foreign countries. We quantify our model by estimating these fixed costs and also how attractive it is to source intermediates from countries all over the world. And with our model being quantified, we basically run the following counterfactuals, which are related to the past Trump administration, in particular the first 2. We model a 25% increase in the strictness of rules of origin. You can think of this as the transition from NAFTA to USMCA, which increased the strictness of these rules. A 5% tariff on all Mexican imports. This was a proposal by Donald Trump in 2019. And a removal of rules of origin. Okay? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. I think this is super important paper. So I just want to understand something. When you say there's a fixed cost associated with using rules of origin, what do you have in mind? Is it like paperwork or you have to register the product? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I would rather say it a fixed cost of using the trade agreement. right?
So what do you have in mind?
Think of rules of origin sort of like the marginal cost of using the trade agreement, but there's also going to be a fixed cost of using the trade agreement. So yeah, paperwork, right? If I want to start using NAFTA or USMCA nowadays,
that you have to register the product.
I have to register, I have to learn, I have to keep track of all of my suppliers. I have to comply with other regulations, for example, environmental, labor, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be a fixed cost of using the trade agreement for being.
Great. And while we're on it, sorry to ask you again, but do you have an estimate of what proportion of U.S.-Mexico trade does actually use the NAFTA?
I'm going to show you a figure.
Okay,
and
great.
Let me know
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you don't do this paperwork, what happens?
If I go to the border as a Mexican firm and I don't present the paperwork, I cannot use NAFTA or USMCA nowadays. And then I would have to pay, I would have to export using WTO status. I would have to pay the tariff.
I see.
MFN, yeah, the MFN tariff. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it could be zero. And in that case, under my framework, I wouldn't have any incentives to use NAFTA to export. Okay? First, data sources. The first data source is customs data from the Bank of Mexico. I have transaction level data in which I observe exports of final goods to the US and Canada, imports of intermediates all over the world, and most importantly and crucial for this project, I can observe at the transaction level whether the firm used NAFTA or not for its exports to the United States. This data is from September 2014 to June 2020. Why September 2014? Because that's when they started keeping track of this variable. Why June 2020? Because that's right before the introduction of USMCA, for which I don't have data in terms of rules of origin. Okay, so the first data source is basically, I observed that firm A exported a car to the United States. It purchased plastic from China and steel from the United States, for example. That's the first data source. The second, yeah. Sure, that's okay.
When you say using WTO, you mean they just pay MFN?
They just pay MFN. Yeah, they chose not to use the trade agreement. Yeah, thank you. Okay, the second data source is IO tables from the BEA for 2017, which basically are going to tell me a car is made of, let's say, 60% plastic, 40% steel. Okay, that's what I use that data for. The third data source are the rules of origin in the NAFTA agreement. This data comes from the Paula Conconi and authors paper, which are basically going to tell me, hey, whenever you export a car to the United States, you can source the plastic from anywhere in the world, but you have to source the steel exclusively from North American countries, okay? So I basically combine the second and third data source to come up with a measure of rule of origin strictness. If I know that a car is made 60% plastic and 40% steel, and I know that the steel has to be sourced from within North American countries, I would say 40% of a car's inputs need to be sourced from North American countries, okay? So it's a measure between 0 and 1. Yeah.
A lot of these rules say about specific products, or they're about, you know, the shared value added or some product, or it's like steels.
Those
are exceptions. No?
Yeah, those are exceptions. There are some products for which you can either satisfy these types of rules of origin, or you can satisfy these value-added rules. Those are the minority of products, and I exclude them from the sample. So these guys that are going to have in my sample need to satisfy these types of rules of origin.
So, say this specific product has to be bought in North America.
Exactly. Yeah, and they use HS classification changes. So this product with this certain HS code, all of the intermediate inputs that fall within the same chapter, I think, you need to source them from North America. The rest of them, you can just buy them anywhere.
And you have data on prices for unit values?
No, I don't use it.
Because, of course, you know, when you bargain with this guy,
yeah,
you will put the price where you are different.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't have any data on unit values. Okay, and the fourth data sources are the U.S. tariffs that a firm that's choosing not to use the trade agreement would have to pay when exporting to the United States, okay? So we're gonna think about rules of origin, sort of like the marginal cost of using the trade agreement. But why? Because it might increase the price of my intermediates and therefore increase my marginal cost. Think of the tariffs as the marginal benefit of using the trade agreement. Why? Because we're only gonna include ad valorem tariffs, so it's a marginal benefit of using NAFTA to export to the United States, okay? First empirical fact, there's a positive correlation between tariffs and rules of origin, okay? Meaning, if it's more attractive to use NAFTA to export, if the MFN tariff is higher, it's also costlier to comply with these rules of origin in terms of the price of my intermediates. So firms are facing a trade-off when choosing whether to use it or not for their exports to the United States, okay? Second empirical fact, what am I doing here? I'm estimating this linear probability model. This is a dummy for whether the firm used NAFTA or not for its exports to the United States. I'm regressing it against deciles of firm size, and I'm controlling for the firm level incentives using the trade agreement. That is either the rule of origin and the MFN tariff, okay? And what I'm showing in that picture are the predicted, like beta 0 plus beta k, okay? Like the predicted probability of using NAFTA to export by firm decile, the size decile, yeah. 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 Like total exports to not only the US, but anywhere. That's how I proxy for firm size. Yeah, because it's just customs data, and I'm not able to merge it to any other data set. So yeah. Okay? So what do we observe in here? We observe an inverse U shape. Now, how do we rationalize this inverse U shape? As I said before, Mexican exporters should be facing fixed costs of using the trade agreement and fixed costs of sourcing from foreign countries, okay? Fixed costs of using the trade agreement are basically gonna rationalize this part of the U shape, okay? When you're small, it's really costly for you to use the trade agreement. Maybe you're really small, or you're only gonna export once, et cetera, so it's less likely that you're gonna be using NAFTA to export, okay? Now, more interesting is what happens with the larger firms. Think about it. If there's a fixed cost of sourcing, it basically means that let's say that you're a medium-sized firm, it's really costly for you to access many international input markets. Now compare it with a larger firm. As firm size grows larger, a firm's ability to source from countries all over the world increases. And therefore, the opportunity cost of being restricted by rules of origin is gonna go up. So it's gonna be costlier to comply with rules of origin. So this guy in here, this guy can purchase every intermediate input from countries all over the world. So it's really costly to be constrained by rules of origin compared to a medium-sized firm or a small firm. It's gonna be cheaper for those guys. Yeah.
That may be possible, but we could actually verify that we could control for the number of countries that is sourcing from and see if the inverse U shape was good.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. Sure, but I can check for that. Okay. Now the third empirical fact, basically again, I'm regressing a linear probability model where S is a dummy for whether the firm purchased an intermediate input from a non-NAFTA country, let's say China, okay, against this also firm size, including industry time fixed effects. And I'm estimating this equation separately for firms using NAFTA and those not using NAFTA to export, okay? So what can we learn from these results? One, it's very intuitive. The larger firm size is, the greater the probability that firm is purchasing inputs from China, okay? Second thing we can learn from here, across all deciles of firm size, firms not using NAFTA to export, the green points in here, are more likely that they're going to be sourcing inputs from China than firms using NAFTA to export, okay? This is mechanical, right? They're restricted by rules of origin, so it's less likely these blue guys are going to be sourcing intermediates from China. But now what I find more interesting in here is what happens to this gap. We can see in here that the gap between, let's say, the lower deciles and the higher deciles is increasing, right? And this should also be rationalized by fixed costs of sourcing, saying, when you're small, it doesn't really matter whether you use NAFTA to export or not. It doesn't really matter whether you're restricted by rules of origin or not. You're small, you can source from China either way. As firm size grows larger, now the ability to source inputs from China goes up, and now using NAFTA and being restricted by rules of origin, now it introduces a change in sourcing behavior. Okay? Any questions? Yeah.
Because the larger are so much bigger than the other ones, right? A lot of the trade goes outside of NAFTA, this one thing was wider.
Yeah. Right.
I heard it's like 40% or something of trade.
I'm not sure, but yeah. Okay. All right.
Can you see whether there are FDI firms in there?
No.
Because the sourcing decision could depend on the FDI status of the firm. Perhaps these are the Chinese firm that they are picking up that they are investing in Mexico in order to access the US market and the source from China.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I don't have information on that. Yeah, for example, if China opened the factory in Mexico, I don't know if that's a Chinese intermediate input, but in my data that would be counted as a Mexican intermediate input. Right, that would be a Mexican intermediate input, even though it was like FDI and it's a Chinese owned factory and so on. Yeah. Did I look at what, sorry?
At switchers.
Oh, okay.
The given product, the given firm, do they switch or they always say one for both?
I haven't looked into it, but it would be interesting, yeah. Okay, so these empirical facts basically motivate that Mexican firms are facing fixed costs of sourcing and using the trade agreement. So we built this model, which is basically extending the Trustford and Tintanot global input sourcing model. We're going to include in it the choice of the choice of using the trade agreement, and we're also going to include rules of origin in it. We include sectors and industries in there just to make use of the richness of our rule of origin and tariff data. Okay, and these are going to be the key ingredients of our model. We have CS demand and monopolistic competition final good producers in Mexico. These guys are exporting to the United States and importing intermediate inputs from all over the world. Yeah.
Another dimension of tariff is Mexico's tariff on intermediate inputs. That would also affect your decision about to outsource from a third country.
Right. We also take into account Mexico's tariffs on intermediates when we do the quantification of the model. But yeah, let me go back to that point and how we don't do anything about it. We just estimate it as a whole, let's say, how attractive it is to source intermediates from China, for example, and the tariff that Mexico charges to those intermediates is going to be contained in there. But we don't do anything besides that. But we could use, we could do a counterfactual exercise in which we say, oh, Mexico increased the tariffs from intermediates coming from China, and that's going to be reflected. There's a way for us to do that, and it's an interesting exercise. Okay? Firms are going to source a continuum of intermediate inputs, and as on the untrusted paid model, basically they're going to choose from which countries they can source their intermediates. Okay? Where global suppliers of inputs are competitive in nature. The demand side is pretty straightforward. Individuals, well, first of all, this is a partial equilibrium model. I want to be clear about that. I'm just studying Mexican exporters and US consumers, okay? So consumers in the US are basically going to value consumption of Mexican varieties according to this utility function in order to maximize it, subject to its budget constraint, okay? And there's going to be sectors in Mexico, and within these are going to be industries and varieties, Mexican varieties within these industries, okay? Now for the supply side, let's define these things. Kappa is going to be a binary variable, 0 if you choose not to use the trade agreement, 1 if you choose to use it, okay? The rest of the objects are going to be exogenous to the firm, right? Lambda is the rule of origin strictness, the share of your intermediates that are restricted to be sourced from within North American countries. Tau is just the ad valorem tariff you would have to pay if you choose not to use the trade agreement. And then you have the fixed cost. Zeta, the fixed cost of using the trade agreement, and FJ, the fixed cost of being able to source intermediates from country J, okay? So I am a firm in Mexico. I observe these, the rule of origin, the tariff, the fixed costs I would have to pay. I also observe my productivity draw, and I choose whether I'm going to use NAFTA or not. and I also choose the set of countries from which I'm going to be source intermediate inputs. Okay? Now this is the price of intermediate inputs. J is going to be the set of countries from which I can source intermediates. Okay? And of course, it's going to be an endogenous object. I'm going to pay a fixed cost for each one of the countries in J, right? N is just the set of NAFTA countries, so Mexico, US, and Canada. So the price of a certain firm pays for a certain intermediate input is going to be a piecewise function like this, okay? It's going to depend on one, whether I use NAFTA or not. Let's say that I do use NAFTA, so kappa is equal to 1. The price I pay for a certain intermediate, it's going to depend on whether the intermediate is restrictive or is not restricted by rules of origin. For those intermediates restricted on the rules of origin, I'm going to choose the cheapest supplier, but only within like North American countries and intersected with J, okay? For any other intermediate that it's not restricted by rules of origin, I'm going to freely source them from around the world, or the countries that I paid a fixed cost for, in this case, J, okay? Now, we have the CES aggregator for marginal cost over the price of inputs. So I would say that this is like the key equation of the model, right? Assuming a Fréchet distribution, we get this expression. And what is it saying? It's basically saying the marginal cost of exporting and producing, it's a decreasing function of productivity, firm productivity in here. It's a weekly increasing function on the tariff tau. And why do I say weekly? Because you could be choosing not to use the trade agreement, that is kappa equal to 1, and this part would disappear, of course. And it's also a weekly increasing function on rule of origin lambda, okay? Why do I say weekly in this case? First of all, you could choose not to use the trade agreement, right? Kappa equal to 0, in which case the rule of origin would go away. But let's say that you're using the trade agreement. It's still weekly increasing. Why? Basically, what rules of origin are creating in here is like a weighted average between, let's say, intuitively speaking, how efficient is all of the countries in J, are all of the countries in J in supplying intermediates versus just the countries in the NAFTA region in your set J, okay? So it's like a weighted average between North America and all of the world, okay? Now, weekly increasing, in the terms in here, is basically think of this as how efficient is, or how attractive is China at supplying intermediates to this particular firm in Mexico or industry in Mexico, okay? Now, what if this psi in here, this phi in here are equal to each other? In that case, rules of origin wouldn't have an effect over marginal cost. That would only be the case if, for example, imagine that set N intersected with J is the same as J, right? So that is like a firm that is small enough that it cannot source intermediates from China, for example. That would be the case in which these two are equal to each other. Or for example, if a certain country, for a certain industry in Mexico, this term in here is 0. For example, the only countries that are efficient at supplying intermediates to my industry are Mexico, US, and Canada, right? In that case, rules of origin wouldn't have an effect on my marginal cost, but that's very unlikely. So another thing in here that we can learn is basically when is the effect of rules of origin going to be larger? For example, an increase in lambda, when is the effect going to be larger over marginal cost? It's going to be larger, the larger the difference between this psi and this phi. I think those are the correct names for those, okay?
Those of origin are not more likely to be more stringent where they are less competitive?
Yeah. I don't have it in the paper. But I have a figure in which I do find that those industries in North America that have the greatest comparative disadvantage, they have higher rules of origin on average. Yeah, lobbying, yeah. Okay. Now, when is the difference between this term and this term going to be? When is the effect of rules of origin going to be larger? When the difference between this term and this term is the largest. Meaning, for example, if North American countries are less efficient at supplying intermediates, then there's going to be a greater difference between this, and the effect of rules of origin is going to be larger. Okay. Another interesting thing in here is that, for example, the larger this exponent is, the larger the effect of an increase in lambda. It's going to magnify the differences between this term and this term. Okay. When is this exponent large? Either the substitution parameter is high, or the shape parameter of the Frechet distribution is low. So this is basically saying the more complementary inputs are, the stronger the effect of an increase in rules of origin, right? The more unique intermediates are, the stronger the effect of me being restricted in terms of my input sourcing. The other extreme case is, for example, if inputs are perfect substitutes, I don't care for rules of origin, right? I'm just going to use for production the intermediate for which North America is really efficient at supplying, okay? A low theta basically means that the pattern of comparative advantage across the world is stronger. So basically saying this, the more unique countries are, the stronger the effect of rules of origin, okay? Just for computational convenience, I'm assuming that firms first choose whether they're going to use NAFTA or not, and then they choose the set of countries for which they're going to be able to source intermediates, right? So I'm assuming that given that you have already chosen that you're going to use NAFTA or not, firms are going to choose the set of countries from which they can source their intermediates in order to maximize their operating profits, subject to paying a fixed cost for each one of these countries, okay? And going one step backwards, firms are going to choose either, NAFTA or not NAFTA that maximizes their profits, subject to paying a fixed cost of using NAFTA if they choose to do so.
And does that make it easier to solve the model? Is that why you do it in these two steps? Like, is there like some weird combinatorial issue that you would need to deal with, or no?
I mean, this is combinatorial, right? This part. I don't know if I had chosen like the reversed order, if it would be more complicated or less complicated computationally speaking. I just have to take a stand, right, on which one they're choosing first. Okay, to quantify the model, we basically include 44 industries. These are HS2 digits. Within these broadly defined 6 sectors: agriculture, minerals, skins, mining, manufacturing, and others. Okay? I'm assuming that Mexican firms can only source from 5 different regions: Mexico, the domestic country, US, Canada, China, Europe, and the rest of the world. Okay? This is also for computational convenience. Within a sector, they basically feed into the model this data, right? The rule of origin, the share of intermediates that are restricted in these sectors, right? MFN tariffs, we just take the data for the US. We estimate sourcing potentials. Sourcing potentials are basically these terms inside of here. How attractive it is for a Mexican firm in the automotive sector to source intermediates from China. We basically estimate those and the number of firms in a sector. Okay, and within an industry, firms are only going to be heterogeneous in terms of their productivity. The quantification is as follows. We basically take some parameters from the literature. Second, we estimate sourcing potentials. That is how attractive it is for me in the automotive sector to be able to source intermediates from China. To do this, we basically take data on observed input shares at the firm level, and we regress it against industry country fixed effects. Okay? And third, we use simulate method of moments to independently estimate at the sectoral level US market demand, fixed cost of sourcing from foreign countries, and the fixed cost of using NAFTA to export. Okay? Now, as I was saying before, we run 3 counterfactuals. The first one is trying to, in the spirit of the,
I guess that's maybe related to Ina's question. Like, you need to prove the supermodularity or submodularity of the return function, right? To apply this.
Yeah.
And then, because you have a little bit different function than it does.
Yeah. Supermodularity doesn't hold in this case. Also, the thing is that
so how do you deal with the
I just brute force it. Okay. Right? I just have 5 different. That's why I group countries into these 5 regions. Okay. Now,
supermodularity doesn't hold. Maybe maybe some modularity codes.
I haven't checked.
Because then we can use what we do.
Right. Yeah. I can go deeper into this computational things, but the thing is that this is not a paper about I want to explain why they source from these 30 different countries all over the world, right? I just want to do this quantification to capture like the cost of being restricted by rules of origin, right? So as long as I'm able to estimate like the difference between this term and this term, J minus N, right, would be the cost of using NAFTA to export, right? Not being able to access those countries outside of North America. So I think I could get away in terms of just having like one non-NAFTA country and one NAFTA country, and that would be it, right? So I don't think how helpful it would be for the paper to assume we have 30 different sourcing countries and do these computational tricks to be able to get over the cultural. Okay. So today I'm just going to discuss the results of the first counterfactual. I'm going to focus on my explanation on whether the US and or Mexico benefit from the policy, just in terms of variables I can explain with the model, which is the change in exports of intermediates to Mexico from the US point of view, the price of Mexican imports, and for Mexico, just the change in firm profits. Okay? So I assume a general increase of 25% in the strictness of rules of origin. And these are the results. Basically, across all sectors, broadly defined sectors, we find that the US and Canada are going to export less to Mexico, less intermediates to Mexico. The US price index for Mexican products is going to go up, and firm profits in Mexico are going to decrease. Okay? Now, what are the mechanisms behind these changes? When rules of origin go up, we have three distinct effects. The first one is pretty straightforward, which is basically that when rules of origin go up, we have to purchase, we as Mexican firms, let's say, we have to purchase more intensively from the US and Canada, right? So that's going to increase US exports of intermediates into Mexico, just like a direct effect, right? On the other hand, when rules of origin go up, I'm going to buy less from China, let's say. So the price of my intermediates is going to increase. That's what I mean by saying sourcing efficiency goes down. That's going to increase my marginal costs, right? Increase the price of exports from Mexico to the US, and that's going to decrease trade in the region, right? If I'm selling less to the US, less final goods to the United States, I'm going to purchase less intermediates from the United States, okay? And of course, there's also a switching effect, which is when rules of origin go up, some firms are going to choose not to use NAFTA to export anymore. And for these firms, these two effects go in the opposite direction, right? Less rules of origin for me, I'm going to purchase less from the United States and Canada. But on the other hand, I'm going to be able to purchase more from China, which is going to decrease my marginal cost, and it's going to increase trade in the region, okay? Lastly, if I stop using NAFTA because rules of origin got stricter, I'm going to have to pay tariffs now, which is going to increase my marginal cost as well, okay? So this is just a table showing like differentiating firms on whether they switched or not. Basically, we have that for the firms that kept using NAFTA even after the increase in rules of origin, yeah, like the share of their inputs coming from the United States and Canada is going to go up, right? But on the other hand, they're sourcing less intensively from non-NAFTA countries, China, Europe, and the rest of the world. So overall, their marginal cost is going to go up. So they're going to sell less to the US, buy less from the United States. And for those firms that stop using NAFTA to export, sure, they're purchasing less from the United States. They're purchasing more from China, well, non-NAFTA countries. But because now they're going to pay tariffs, their marginal cost also goes up. So this would explain why trade goes down. US exports into Mexico would go down in the end. Okay? Now, in the spirit of this paper by Heth, Meyer, and Melitz, the Laffer curve for rules of origin, we basically do the following exercise, like try to see how, for different values of the rule of origin, how does the share of intermediates coming from the United States change? Okay, and we do find that for some, these are fan charts. So think of each one of these lines as an industry. We do find that for some industries, there's a positive rule of origin that maximizes the share of inputs coming from the United States. This would be like the Laffer curve according to our simulation. Okay, but this is the share of inputs coming from the United States. In terms of the value of imports coming from the United States, that would be the figure in here. And we find in our simulations that there's no rule of origin, well, that the best rule of origin is a rule of origin of 0, strictness of 0, right? So any rule of origin, even if you can increase the share, is going to decrease the amount of intermediates the US is going to selling to Mexican firms, okay? All right, just to conclude, so the main message of the paper is the use of a trade agreement depends on firm size. Why? Because the opportunity cost of complying with these rules of origin depends on my ability to source from foreign countries. If I am small and I can only source domestically, I don't care for rules of origin. If I'm huge and I can source every single intermediate from all over the world, they're going to be really costly for me, okay? Related to what you were saying, rules of origin seek to protect local industries. So they are stricter in inefficient industries, but this is precisely where they are the costliest, okay? And lastly, related to my contrafactual results, you know, rules of origin seek to increase the regional content in exports, right? Which is basically like saying we want to take a larger share of the pie. Well, if rules of origin go up, in the first place, you might not take a larger share of the pie, right? Because firms can choose not to use the trade agreement. But even if you increase the share of the pie you're taking home, maybe you're decreasing the size of the pie, right? And in the end, maybe you're getting less pie. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have the discussion. And
well, thank you so much for giving me the chance to discuss this paper. So this is going to be the structure of my discussion. First, I'm going to just talk about the motivation of rules of origin and give you a bit of what they are and what they're in place and so on and so forth. Then I'm going to try to be super fast in explaining what the paper does. And then I'm going to just give you some comments. So the question is, when is a good considered as domestic? And this is clearly a super challenging and increasingly difficult question to answer, right? Like in the world of global value chains, it's very hard to keep track of all goods and where they are produced. So then rules of origin, they specify the conditions for a good to be considered domestic. And why does it matter? It matters for the application of RTAs. If we want to give a preferential treatment to a particular good, first of all, we need to know whether that good has been produced within the RTA. There are two types of rules of origin in general. Rule number one is value-added requirement. If you're producing a particular car, X% of that value added has to be domestic. So it means that in principle, you can combine inputs in different ways as long as when you adapt the value added of these inputs, part of it has to be domestic. Another types of rules of origin, which are very prevalent in NAFTA, are those that are known as the change of tariff classification, which you know, most of the literature and this paper in particular focuses on, which is you cannot combine inputs in the way you want, even if you satisfy some value-added rule. So this means that if you're producing an HS6, you know, a particular car, there is a list of inputs that are totally restricted from using them as long as they are not, you know, if they are not domestic. So for a list of intermediate inputs, they have to be domestic for you to be able to use them, even if you just use epsilon of them. And this is clearly a very high restriction when thinking about what is the sourcing optimal strategy of firms. Now, what is the main goal that policymakers have in mind when writing rules of origin? Traditionally, the goal was to avoid tariff circumvention, trade deflation. The fact that if my objective is to export to the US, I may want to first export to Mexico and then from Mexico export to the US. But the only framework, the only context in which this makes sense is a context in which MFN charge, US MFN to third countries are much higher than Mexican MFN tariffs to third countries. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to circumvent the MFN US tariffs through Mexico. So a recent paper finds actually that given the fact that MFNs are very similar across countries and given some transportation costs, it doesn't make sense to do actually this circumvention. So rules of origin don't seem to matter anymore for the original goal they were trying to achieve. So in practice, the way people think about rules of origin and the reason why they are in place is because they maximize the amount of trade within the RTA. So they have a protectionistic kind of spirit. And then the question is why policymakers use these particular instruments to do that, but they clearly do, and they do it in a way that seems to go more into this goal rather than the original goal. So then what are the trade-offs that firms face when making choices about sourcing decisions? So first of all, there are low tariffs when exporting to the US if they comply with the rules. This means they use NAFTA. So for me, it's actually much better to export to the US using NAFTA because the preferential tariff is usually lower than the MFN have to pay. So that is the benefit of complying with rules of origin. Well, what is the cost? The cost is the fact that I'm going to be restricted in from which third countries I'm going to be able to source my intermediate inputs. As we said before, because NAFTA rules of origin are written in terms of if you're producing a particular output, there is a list of inputs that are restricted. So if I want to import one of those inputs from third countries, then I cannot, make use of NAFTA, which means that I have to export at a relatively high tariff. So this paper pretty much emphasizes that the extent of this trade-off depends crucially on firm size. If you're a large firm, you are more likely to find optimal to source from many third countries, which means that in principle, the cost of complying with rules of origin is going to be particularly high because it is optimal for you to source from third countries. And if you want to use rules of origin, if you want to use NAFTA and comply with rules of origin, you cannot do that. So for you, it's very costly. So then it means that large firms are going to relatively use NAFTA less as compared to other firms. On the other hand, small firms may not want to comply with NAFTA because even though they don't care about sourcing from other countries, they don't do it, but still there is kind of a fixed cost in terms of paperwork and regulation they have to pay if they really want to use NAFTA. So at the end of the day, what is going to matter is that large firms don't want to comply because it is very costly from the point of view of them in the sense that they cannot source from third countries. For small firms, may not be as costly in terms of this, but it's actually going to be costly because they have to pay the fixed cost. So at the end of the day, what is going to matter is that medium firms, what is going to happen is that medium-sized firms are going to be the ones that are more likely to use rules of origin. And this is precisely kind of the main point in terms of the empirics of this paper. So this paper is emphasizing firm size matters in understanding who complies with rules of origin, and this potentially matters to understanding the effects of rules of origin. So what do? What they do is they have a model of Mexican exporters to the US in which, they just have a couple of extensions. Section number 1, there are rules of origin written in terms of what is the fraction of intermediate inputs that you have to source within NAFTA if you want to export at a relatively low tariff within NAFTA. And then firms can endogenously decide whether they want to use NAFTA or not, which is equivalent of whether they want to comply with the rules of origin or not. So given the measures of rules of origin, the strictness measures of rules of origin they can measure at the industry level, they calibrate the model to match some important moments. One of them is the share of firms using NAFTA to export, something that we saw in the presentation, and the share of firms sourcing from any other third region. So then run some counterfactuals. One of them is imagine now there is an overall increase in the strictness of rules of origin across all industries of around 25%. What is going to be the effect on trade within the region? And the main result, which I guess is the one that matters, because as I told you before, now it seems to be the case that what policymakers have in mind when writing these rules is to maximize the amount of trade within the RTA. And there is all this idea that when NAFTA was created, most of the rules of origin that were written in NAFTA were inherited from the previous trade agreement between Canada and the US. So from the point of view of Mexico, they were taken as given. So most of it, most of the action, most of the rules of origin were probably written to maximize the amount of US exports to Mexico and Canada. But what they find is actually that rules of origin or increasing rules of origin actually decreases US exports to Mexico. So this doesn't seem to actually achieve the goal that in principle policymakers have in mind when writing these rules of origin. And what is the reason is because the substitution towards US suppliers, now Mexican producers don't want to source from third countries anymore, they're gonna start sourcing from the US. That's gonna maximize or that's going to increase US exports to Mexico, but that's not going to compensate the fact that Mexican exporters overall become less productive. They're able to sell less to the US overall. Because they are able to sell less to the US overall, they're going to decrease the amount of input use from any country, including the US, which means that they're going to, import less from the US. So what is, kind of one of the main comments I have is the following. So the paper emphasizes this new fact, which is the fact that firm size matters in understanding the use of rules of origin. Then writes a model consistent with that fact, use the model to answer a super relevant question. What is the role of rules of origin in trade within NAFTA and, potentially with respect to third countries? But my point is that the paper loses focus towards the end, in the sense that what we would like to know is what is the relevance of the fact that is emphasized in understanding the answer to this question. So in other words, imagine I were to ignore this firm size pattern that we were showing at the beginning, how different the answer to this question would be. So it's really, I'm missing a lot in ignoring firm size, in explaining NAFTA use, and to what extent quantitatively how the answer to this question would be if I were to ignore firm size. So in practice, one could potentially play around with trying different degrees of firm heterogeneity, or just ignoring that fact and calibrating the model somewhere else and emphasizing that actually that matters in answering that question. So what is my recommendation or my suggestion is to keep the focus of the paper as close as possible to the empirical fact you're emphasizing. I had the impression that at the end of the paper, you run many counterfactuals, but you never come back to the main relevant empirical fact that you show at the beginning. So clearly, the model is already complicated, has many valuable insights in my view, but it abstracts from potentially important implications. Some of them you mentioned already. It's kind of partial equilibrium in nature. You're abstracting from what are US exporters gonna do. You could think about a mirror model in which US exporters are also gonna react to changes in the rules, and things may potentially change. And if I believe the fact that the size distribution matters, you may think about the size distribution of exporters in the US being different than that in Mexico and potentially have interesting effects. Now, there is another thing that was mentioned in the presentation is how different things would be if I allow for reallocation of assembly plants or FDI, right? Like firms may want to optimally reallocate their plants and production given rules of origin. 30 seconds. So these, my recommendation would be to discuss potentially important limitations of the framework and compare to others' framework. Just to see whether you're missing something you think is relevant and what you find may relate to this, what other people have found. Then I have a bunch of kind of more minor comments about, I'm not sure why it is necessary to target the size-dependent specific moments. So pretty much is, you are explicitly targeting the size pattern. My prior would have been that once you target the average use of NAFTA, given the structure of your model will give you already kind of a ham shape as the one you have. So it would be nice to know exactly this extra stretch you are imposing by targeting that explicitly. Where is it coming from in terms of the distribution of fixed cost, or whether you need it at all. Then I was also missing some information about how the lambdas are computed. Like in the empirics, it seems like you compute it at the 6-digit level, but then in the model it's at the 2-digit level. It is not obvious whether you do it in terms of value-added share or in terms of the number of products. For example, something that is very remarkable about rules of origin is that there are some outputs for which you have 2,000 restricted inputs. And clearly these 2,000 restricted inputs are never used for the production of that output. So in that sense, rules are never binding. And I would like to know exactly how you are dealing with this in the way you compute the lambdas. So anyway, just to summarize, I'm running out of time. I really enjoyed reading this paper, some new facts, serious quantitative work and policy relevant results. And I think it's a super nice contribution to the RO literature. So I really enjoyed it.
So why don't we ask for questions and then maybe he can answer. Okay, Maggie down there behind the column.
So I have another question about Mexico's other FTAs. Another explanation for this large firm effect could be that these large firms also export to a lot of markets, and Mexico is one of the hubs in the FTA network, right? So if I want to take advantage of other FTAs as well, which have different rules of origin, how would that affect my incentive to comply with the NAFTA rules of origin? So this is outside, obviously the scope of your model and stuff, but I wonder if that could be another explanation for the firm size pattern that you document.
I wanted to ask you about this, the elasticity of substitution you have in the model, and you were saying like this, how the effects will depend really on the elasticity of substitution depending on how complementary the inputs are. So, and I understand you estimated it at the HS2 level. So I mean, depending on what HS you're looking at, this can have a very wide implications. I don't know how difficult it is to do computationally, but because the firms are maybe looking at much narrower products than HS2 when they're deciding their sourcing decisions. So I was just curious how your implications would change if you just go a bit more granular in the sourcing.
All right. First of all, thank you, Manuel, for the thoughtful discussion and for the questions. I'm going to go in order. So first, regarding that it's only partial equilibrium, and I don't know what's going on from the U.S. supply side. I completely agree. I would also ask, I don't know if I could interpret my results as, some sort of short-run effects of rules of origin, right? Because you could also argue that there's kind of infant industry arguments, right? When rules of origin are placed, they're costly. Why? Because I would like to purchase intermediates from China, but I have to do it from the US. But maybe that same production is eventually going to make US a great supplier of steel, right? Which would be interpreted in the model as an increase in the sourcing potential of the US for a particular industry, right? And I'm abstracting away from all of those effects. So yeah, I agree with you. We could improve more in different avenues, right? The second question was related to what about reallocation of firms' production and so on. There's I work at the Bank of Mexico, right? And there was this recent proposal for a 25% tariff for those exports not using USMCA, right? So we did this exercise using this model in which basically we compared two different comparative statics exercise in which we basically compared what would happen to exports, Mexican exports, if this new policy is implemented, assuming that firms have a degree of flexibility in adjusting their sourcing strategies, right? This is related to your question. So what we found is that if firms had zero ability to change the sourcing of their intermediates or zero ability to reallocate in some way production domestically, or at least to the region, the fall in trade given the proposal will be large, right? I would like to use NAFTA now that we have a tariff if we don't use USMCA, but because I cannot adjust in the short run, for example, the origin of my intermediates or the location of my production, I'm not going to be able to use USMCA to export or NAFTA to export, right? On the other hand, if we assume full flexibility, right, either because I am a small firm or products are not very specific or complex, I can easily switch or reallocate my production domestically. I'm going to be able to switch to using the trade agreement. And in that case, exports are going to increase given an increase in the tariff outside of the trade agreement. Why? Because I have incentives to start using it. Therefore, I'm going to pay lower tariffs and exports are going to increase. Okay, so that's another interesting avenue that we can take the paper if. Why target size-specific moments in our estimation? I would say because we think it is important for, precisely because I'm saying that the U-shape, the inverse U-shape that I observe, the first part of the U-shape is governed by, let's say, small firms' ability to use the trade agreement, right? So, for example, using the use of the trade, using the share of firms of the smallest decile or quintile, I think, the estimation that use the trade agreement is informative for me of how large the fixed cost of using the trade agreement needs to be to replicate this pattern that we observe in the data. Okay, and the same for the second part of the inverse U shape, in which we observe that firms, medium-sized firms, use the trade agreement more intensively compared to larger firms, right? So that's why we try to match this by quintiles of firm size in the paper. Okay. How do I compute the lambdas, the rule of origin strictness? Yeah, in the empirical application, we compute them at the 6-digit level. When we quantify the model, we average them at the 2-digit level, okay, using trade value as weights. Okay, so it's a weighted average of the 6-digit level rules of origin.
Just want to follow up on my point about the complementary substitutabilities.
Yeah.
I think if you have positive complementarities, actually, the whole point of your paper is whether you have many sources, right? Because if you're a big firm and you have positive complementarities, then you have this advantage of sourcing 100 origins. Well, if there's substitutabilities, you always choose one or two, right? Because these are very substitutable, so you choose. So I'm not saying, I'm not advocating now to use any algorithms or don't do brute force. I'm just saying, like, at the core of your idea of firms being big and taking advantage of that is also like the relationship with complementarities and many origins.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Then the next question was, what about other free trade agreements, right, that Mexico has with, I don't know, the European Union and so on? Sure, you can think of, I don't know if this is the case, but perhaps the rules of origin in the USMCA agreement are very similar to those with the European trade agreement, and maybe firms would have an extra incentive to change the sourcing of intermediates because now they can comply with those rules of origin and the ones with Europe. But the thing is that I think that around 85% of Mexico's exports are to the United States. So I would say that it's more likely that they're adjusting their sourcing strategy to the US rules of origin, even if they're also exporting to other countries around the world. Okay? And lastly, the question about the substitution parameter. Even though I quantify the model at the sectoral level, I'm assuming a homogeneous elasticity substitution. Okay? So I have no heterogeneity in there. But yeah, it would be interesting to have sector-specific estimates for this elasticity, which governs the effect of rules of origin, as I said before. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we will reconvene tomorrow at breakfast and then the beginning of the conference.
Gracias.